Think about what our hips are doing in our front splits, and in lunges, a similar stretch for that back leg. We're gonna think about our hip bones as having eyeballs. Let's start taking a look at what this is like in a lunge. We're really just thinking about stretching one leg at a time. So in our traditional lunge, our goal is to be stretching the front of that back leg hip. So those are our hip flexors, the muscles coming through the front of that leg. When we're thinking about our hip position, we want to be thinking about taking our hip eyeballs, facing them both forwards, but also having them lifted. So we're looking straight forwards, not down towards the floor. As we lift our hip eyeballs, we can think about tucking our tailbone towards the floor or lifting our pubic bone towards the ceiling. That's what's going to give us more of a stretching sensation in the front of that leg. If we deviate from this position, if our hip eyeballs look out to the side, we lose some of that stretch. If they're looking forwards, but we lean forwards and our hip eyeballs start to look down towards the floor, you're also going to notice we lose some of that stretch. The same thing happens in our front split. In our front split, if I'm in a forward fold, you can see that my hip bones and my hip eyeballs are angled down towards the floor. This may give you a great stretch in your front leg, but you're not really getting any kind of a stretch in that back leg. For most people, lowering to a flat split, we need that back leg to be really flexible. So this is where lifting our torso by taking yoga blocks underneath our hands can be really helpful. Going from my forward folded position, where my hip eyeballs are looking towards the floor, to lifting my chest. You can see what this starts to do is rotate my pelvis backwards a little bit. So now my hip eyeballs are pointing straight forwards towards those front toes, and I'm getting a sweet, sweet stretch through the front of that back leg. Even though this feels more challenging and looks, frankly, way less splitty, this is gonna be a better way to train your splits if your goal is to eventually get your flat split on the floor with your chest lifted and both of your hips square to the front. Let me use my friend Pelvis Presley here to demonstrate what's happening with our hip flexors when we're in a forward fold. So if we're forward folding in our front split, we've got some of our hip flexors that come out of our lumbar spine across the front of our hip. Some of them also come out of the hip bone themselves, but for simplicity and ease of use with this band, we're gonna pretend all of them are coming out of the back side of our hip. They're gonna cross over the front of our hip bone, and our hip flexors attach to kind of the front side of our thigh. You can see that while my skeleton here is leaning forwards, there's a little bit of slack in these muscles. They're not getting much of a stretch. If we lift our torso on up, you can see that the tension's starting to be pulled into those muscles. And that's why it feels like more of a stretch. So when we lean forwards, our hip bones rotate forwards, which lessens the stretch of the muscles in the front of the hip. When we lean backwards and bring that torso upright, those muscles that come across the front of our hip bones are getting more of a stretch.
So to summarize, our hip position in a front split influences what muscles are being stretched. When our hips tilt forwards, or our hip eyeballs are pointing down towards the floor, that increases the hamstring stretch in the front leg, but it takes away some of the hip flexor stretch in the back leg. Alternatively, when our hip bones start to tilt backwards, or our hip eyeballs are starting to lift up and look straight ahead, that increases the hip flexor stretch in the back leg, takes some of the hamstring stretch away from that front leg. My experience, most students who end up leaning forwards in their front splits don't even realize it, and they're doing it because it's a more comfortable position. They're unintentionally avoiding a more challenging stretch where that hip flexor in the back leg, which is a little bit tight, is getting a stretch. But we only need so much hamstring flexibility when it comes to our front splits. For most people, we need a lot more hip flexor flexibility. So that means it makes less sense to lean forward and really work on improving the hamstring flexibility when we're not even working on those hip flexors. So if you're someone who finds lifting your torso up in your front splits so that your shoulders are stacked on top of your hips is a challenging position, that probably means your hip flexors are tight and they're probably trying to avoid a stretch. You should work in that more challenging position a little bit more often. However, if you're someone who feels a lot of a hamstring stretch in your front split, even when your torso is lifted, that's a sign that you're probably someone who has tighter hamstrings, and you might benefit from doing more forward fold work in your front splits where it's a more challenging position for your body. At the end of the day, it's all about choosing the stretch that's a better fit for your body and your personal pulse.